improve decision-making for over 20 years. He has done extensive work in areas including communicable chronic and zoonotic diseases, social and environmental epidemiology, and tobacco policy. And he will also be the instructor for our agent-based modeling workshop tomorrow. The title of his speech today is Designing Complex Intervention and Treatment Strategies, Key Opportunities. Let's welcome Professor Osgood.
Thank you very, very much for that kind introduction, and it's a great pleasure and privilege to be here today to share with you some of the work and some of the approaches that we're taking within this broad area of addressing complex treatment and, by extension, intervention strategies. This was a topic that on which I was asked to present, and on reflecting on it, I realized that it's a topic where the methodologies involved are evolving now at a faster rate than I've seen over my 25 years of practice in applying dynamic modeling, first through agent-based techniques and later through system dynamics. And I think about how to organize this talk. I considered a variety of projects that we undertake that are responsive to this general idea and it would fit in this rubric, but any one of those projects would only have illustrated a small number of what I think are the large opportunities which are afforded us because of this methodological innovation which is now occurring. And I've therefore taken the liberty of organizing the talk around what I see as sort of key opportunities for that are responsive to this need to address complex treatment and intervention strategies, and talking within each of those areas about particular projects which we've worked on which do apply those techniques. So the talk's going to be put on its side compared to some of the others you will have heard. I want to thank the organizers for making it possible for me to be here, Professor Matcher particularly, Amina and Samina and Yuan, who have provided a lot of logistical support, and finally to all of you for making this event possible. So I'm going to begin by just highlighting the important motivation of this work and all my work indeed in the growing challenges associated with making decision making on issues of key health import. I work in the area of applying system science, the science of the whole, as it were, to causally tangled and complex issues that confront us increasingly within population health area. Within the health area, we see all the hallmarks of complex systems: delays, feedbacks, nonlinearities, and presence of heterogeneity, which, while we may see a small number of people of certain sorts in the population, the tail can wag the dog. Those individuals can have a disproportionate impact in shaping the cost and health outcomes associated with the population as a whole. And so whether it's through blowback effects, cases of policy resistance, through syndemics, cases of interacting conditions that amplify and reinforce one another, the growing challenges of our aging population and the occurrence of routine comorbidities, whether it's the One World, One Health initiative, on which I play a substantive role, where we're concerned about emerging new infections and zoonoses, or the growing recognition of the impact of intergenerational factors and the potential role of epigenetics in shaping life course outcomes within the broader population. We're dealing with the fact that we're often trying to identify key leverage points where with modest investment of resources we can make a big difference in our healthcare systems. Some of the areas in which we work, and this is just a modest subset of them, are illustrated here, and they span the gamut from zoonotics to chronic disease to infectious disease, and in fact a lot of interactions between them. We see important ways in which communicable diseases such as TB end up interacting with chronic diseases because of immune system involvement, for example. Now, I wanted to pause at this slide where I've identified a set of what I consider quite urgent needs when it comes to building up, to analyzing and to making recommendations related to complex treatment and intervention strategies. The first is the importance of a longitudinal perspective. This has been highlighted by several of those before me very nicely, by Dr. Sloot, for example, Dr. Young, and most recently by Dr. Carnan. The fact is that increasingly we're looking to solutions which confer individualized treatment within the course of care. And our understanding is growing about life course effects, where early life insults, whether it's exposure in utero to diabetes, a topic of central importance in our research, or whether it's adverse early childhood experiences, the ways in which those confer lifelong risk for individuals. And there's a growing recognition of the role epigenetics plays with histones and other mechanisms, keeping these memories, as it were, of earlier life experiences in effects that can last across generations and have been demonstrated in animal models and plausibly underlie some of the epidemiological effects we see. Well, there's also a long-time recognition now, starting in the 1980s in the STI context and moving forward in recent years to areas of chronic disease risk factors and so on, of the ways in which networks play a key mediating role in shaping our health, whether it's social networks, needle-sharing networks, networks of sexual contact, or networks that affect our knowledge, attitudes, and beliefs on the health front. Network structure imposes a significant footprint on the dynamics we see over time of systems, and often provide a key potential place for intervening in the context of complex intervention strategies. Strategies, for example, which may build up networks so that people are conferred additional social capital or conferred additional sources for information which may shape their subsequent health behaviors. Another issue has to do with the importance of heterogeneity. I had noted this earlier, and as early in the 1980s, the work of associated with gonorrhea by York highlighted what's now regarded as a central part of STI control in the form of core network theory. And we have a recognition of the fact that, again, small numbers of people can have a disproportionate impact in shaping the health of the overall population. And this is particularly true and particularly obvious in the case of pathogen transmission, but it also seems to play an important role in some other areas as well. Another issue is the importance of relationships and the importance of social, long-time persistent social context in shaping health behavior. Jay had just mentioned in that slide about the Men's Health Clinic, some of the pronounced disparities we see across gender lines, for example, and health-seeking behavior in self-management and in other aspects germane to health. And whether it's in the context of long-term committed relationships, whether it's in the context of mother-child relationships, or caregiver and the elderly in the context of dementia. Relationships are at the core of shaping people's health behaviors in diagnosis, in care seeking, in effectiveness of self-management, etc. Another key goal that we see emerging in the context of exploring complex intervention and treatment strategies is need for flexibility and level of detail of modeling incorporated. And I'm going to be talking about the role that hybrid modeling can play in fitting into this context. And finally, some ways in which needs in terms of shaping behavioral responses, nudging people in a fashion that was mentioned earlier yesterday, and can confer larger health impact. And finally, in a topic that is near and dear to my heart, I stand before you. It was mentioned yesterday by Alex, I think. He had a quote from the skeptical environmentalist. And I stand before you as a skeptical modeler. As my colleague Liz Brook at Michigan has commented, too many of us as modelers have been seduced and then jilted by our models. We've seen a model that incorporates the very best of the evidence available to us, into which we put a huge amount of thought and care, and we found it failing to live up to our expectations in subsequent years. And within the area of designing strategies for complex treatment and intervention strategies, where we're skating at the edge of the unknown, often an adaptive response, a response that can learn over time, long after the model's built, is front and center. So we have a set of research priorities that we've undertaken that are responsive to these needs. And I'm going to be going through successive sets of these in terms of how we respond using each of these to some of the needs I've just articulated. And the first of them that I want to highlight, namely the use of agent-based modeling, relates to a whole set of these desiderata, these needs that we have in the area of designing effective complex intervention strategies. So within this area, we make use of agent-based models, and I want to, partly with an eye towards our workshop tomorrow, I want to highlight a number of features that in the area of designing complex intervention and treatment strategies are particularly relevant for agent-based models. The first of them is the capacity to represent situated perception, decision-making on the context of individuals. Whether it's in terms of risk perception associated with risk behavior for STIs, whether it's in the area of chronic disease risk associated with behavioral risk factors such as sedentary behavior, such as as low levels of physical activity or low poor quality eating habits. People pick up cues from their environment, and those cues that they pick up are cues about their particular localized environment. They're making decision makings with respect to social distancing based on observation of how many people that they know or in their immediate social network may have been affected by a particularly severe case of the flu. We may have cases where people's health behavior and choices involving safe sexual practices and so on are affected by their sexual partners. So the issue of behavior change on the part of individuals and motivating that behavior change is strongly impacted by their experiences through localized perception. Similarly, learning takes place based on available information that are not global in nature, but are often available to an individual in their particular context. Longitudinal progression, I mentioned the importance of the recognized importance of life course effects, both in the chronic and certain types of infectious diseases. And there's an increasing need to, in the context of these types of interventions, to calibrate to match up longitudinal data. While in the context of system dynamics models, we're typically dealing with models that give us a depiction over time of cross sections of our population. When we need to deal with matching longitudinal data, individual-based models come to the fore in terms of a key technique. We will often need to represent network context, sometimes at multiple levels of detail, say an individual, their neighborhood, and the broader city. And once again, agent-based models, by incorporating these factors of networks in spatial context, can be very useful. It was noted earlier that individual-based models to represent heterogeneity can offer a much more scalable and flexible option than trying to fold that heterogeneity into a more aggregate model. And this is particularly key when we're dealing with issues of health disparities. We're dealing with issues with transfer effects. Whether or not our intervention may shift burden from one group in the population to another, or disproportionately benefit one group, can be very important. Many of our policies that we tried to plan are targeted. We're talking about complex strategies here. Or can be targeted fruitfully based on people's network position, as is increasingly done in the context of STIs, based on their history, an increasing focus of individualized medicine, and can take into account aspects of their heterogeneity in terms of targeted planning platforms. So, it's long been recognized that even in the chronic disease context, networks play an important role in spreading infection, and work that's done in this area increasingly accounts through the use of agent-based models for these network contexts. Representing the spatial context is also often of key interest in an environmental epi context. This from a study of a prion-based disease that affects deer, but may have potential for hopping to humans within our context. And this a diagram from some TB work which we've done, which Yuan Tian here led an investigation of prioritization of contact tracing mechanisms for TB that takes into account, among other factors, an individual's history. In the context of comorbidities, we also see a real need for individualized approaches, individuated individuals in the context of agents within a broader model. So, for example, here we have representations of individuals' progression among a set of conditions for diabetes on the one hand, tobacco use behavior, and then tuberculosis at the top, where those progressions occur between these different types of health states specific to a condition. And of course there's interaction. So the presence of active smoking may, for example, worsen an individual's development of diabetes. And the occurrence of tobacco smoke may also affect TB. In this sort of context, representing these sort of distinctions within a more aggregate model through stratification of that model is very challenging because of a combinatorial explosion. You have to take into account all possible combinations of categories. In an individual-based context, it's much easier. So we've applied these strategies across a wide variety of conditions, and these are some that have used agent-based modeling within recent years and span the gamut again from zoonoses to infectious to chronic disease. A second need is with respect to flexibility of detail incorporated in the models. We increasingly make use of hybrid techniques which combine the best of many strategies. In our group, we make use of 4 different complex system strategies, which I'll use to denote agent-based modeling, system dynamics modeling, discrete event simulation, and network approaches, as well as combinations with more classic strategies such as decision analysis. And in this context, you can often mix and match, increasingly within a single model, multiple strategies. Each of these types of approaches tends to not only give different answers and pose different model formalisms, but they ask different questions. And increasingly we find that it's fruitful within a single model to combine multiple types to address different questions and different needs over different areas of a model and different areas of potentially the life course. It's my firm conviction from having applied these over dozens, if not hundreds of models, that each of these techniques offers a unique combination of strengths and weaknesses and confers value that's quite distinctive. And there's real synergies that can be obtained by combining multiple ones in a single model. and you can really get something where the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. What you can deduce, and the insights you can get from the combined model go outstrip what you could get through either strategy in isolation or indeed even by a sum of those insights. And so I'll give you a little bit of a glimpse of some of the different strategies we've used. In some cases, we've had part of a model driven in a system dynamics fashion, and agents become individuated at a point in the care continuum where their history, their network context, their heterogeneity becomes central to the analysis. So, for example, at the occurrence of conditions such as diabetes, and henceforth they're represented as agents. In that particular model, they then go through a discrete event process as well in terms of their care seeking. In other cases, we have agent populations driving system dynamics models. So consider, for example, multiple agents associated with tobacco companies seeking to nudge the tobacco use behavior of individuals in the population, and those tobacco companies end up influencing the progression of individuals' behavior over time. And yet other cases we've represented agents within the population as being described, their progression, their evolution over time is being characterized by stocks and flows, by system dynamics formalisms. In a paper we published in 2007, we looked at this as a very powerful platform, and general platform for immunoepidemiology, for understanding the effects of immune memory, the effects of differential levels of immunocompetence across the population, to understand factors such as where flu goes during the summer, to understand the ways in which the presence of individuals with widely divergent levels of immune strength may shape an epidemic's progression. And we've applied it as well as to flu within the chlamydia context, the context of STIs. In other cases, we've taken a broader spatial area, divided it into small grids, each of whose evolution is described by a system dynamics model. And as a final glimpse of a model that's hybrid in character, and one that many of those here who will be attending my workshop tomorrow will see, is models that span agent-based formulation and discrete event. The idea here being we have a population whose epidemiology is depicted and evolves over time according to an agent-based characterization with all the attendant benefits that delivers. And at the point of development of illness where they have complaints that bring them to present for care, they further enter into a discrete event model which can capture the effects of resource limitations, of queuing, as they progress through a care process shown over here. At point of delivery of care, their particular characteristics can be taken into account, their history, for example, past encounters with the healthcare system and other episodes of care. And when released to the population, they continue on in the agent-based context, and that may lead to representation in the case of substandard care, for example. So we can use this sort of model to examine the impacts of interventions focused on the care delivery side, taking into account the representation consequences, taking into account the longer-term impacts at the epidemiological level in the external population. These sort of hybrid models are extremely straightforward to build, and those who are attending my workshop tomorrow will see direct evidence of that by seeing a number of these models, and can confer real substantial insight that covers both the care pathways and the broader epidemiology. So we have a variety of studies which have made use of these techniques of hybrid models, with everything from looking at influenza, the spread of influenza in the population, to cases of longer-term outcomes of type 2 diabetes and particularly renal complications. Another focus of our work that is responsive to the issue of a design of health interventions that are complex in character has to do with understanding microbehaviors of individuals. One of the things that we've repeatedly found in our work is that our ability to represent models as dynamic hypotheses that capture our best guesses as to how things may work in the broader population in terms of people's health behaviors, in terms of their care seeking, that often our ability to describe those models outstrips the evidence available in certain regions of space. And it's reflective of the fact that in many areas of interest, we're interested in behaviors that are poorly captured with traditional survey instruments or other more traditional epidemiological techniques. We found huge disparities in between self-reports and what location tracking actually picks up as the reality related to people's mobility patterns and where they spend their time. When it comes to physical activity, we've known since the NHANES 3 study that there's huge disparities between what people self-report in terms of physical activity levels and what's actually recorded through accelerometry. When it comes to people's contact patterns and spatial proximity, there's huge gaps, once again, between what people recall and what's actually seen when we instrument people with sensors and record people's time together. There's large gaps, some of them reflecting deliberate confabulation, but often just reflecting the fact that people forget very easily with whom they spend time, particularly for more transient contacts, or they exaggerate the amount of time spent with others. So aspects of social context, aspects of their communicational behavior are often poorly picked up, particularly at the fine-grained level that we wish to capture them for our modeling. The real risk here is that absent understanding of such behaviors, the potential to quantitatively evaluate policy trade-offs can be quite limited. We found a number of cases where these types of behaviors make a real difference and could plausibly shift the balance of favorability between different intervention strategies, and where we need to fill in these gaps. An example, a situation that we found quite illustrative of this quandary was something an RCT with which we're involved with Jeannie Brooks Gunn at Columbia University, look at the impacts of housing relocation in urban areas in the United States. This is particularly New York City in conjunction with the New York City Housing Board. And in this case, since the Moving to Opportunity program, there's been substantive evidence available to the effect that relocating individuals from lower income neighborhoods, often quite blighted neighborhoods, to mixed income neighborhoods conveys substantive health benefits for in certain contexts. So specifically, it was noted that for teenage girls, relocation to housing projects in mixed income neighborhoods or availability of higher quality housing conferred lower obesity rates, lower risk of participation in criminal activity, so lower incarceration rates and arrest rates, and improved rates of high school graduation. By contrast, in teenage boys, no effect was found with respect to the first and the last of these, but participation in criminal activity actually slightly increased. And over the years, there was a wide variety of hypotheses advanced as to why this is the case. That variety of hypotheses was reflective of the fact that the evidence base was simply not there. For example, some posited that the positive effects in teenage girls were reflective of the fact that the new neighborhoods offered more opportunities for physical activity, that you could make use of parks, ball courts, etc., and that might lead to favorable changes in BMI and therefore reduced obesity. Others have pointed to sedentary behavior as a potentially key cause of some of these changes. So by having sidewalks that are walkable, just being out in the neighborhood at all times during the day, there may be real benefits in terms of energy expenditure and more favorable energy balance that, again, contribute to lower obesity levels. Others have posited that a lot of the effects may have been mediated by the time spent at home and family cohesion, that families uprooted from their old environment with many of the previous social connections severed spent more time together And because of that, the teenage girls were eating more healthily. They were spending more time at home and less out in the hood, and therefore they had less risk of criminal activity involvement, and were putting more time into their studies. Yet other effects have stressed the importance of school quality as a mediator, or the availability of healthy food in the new neighborhood, pointing to the fact that many of the original neighborhoods may have been in food deserts, and the newer neighborhoods have availability of healthier foods. In short, the evidence-based was just not there, and when we were asked to take an agent-based modeling approach to this, we had to take significant pause. The evidence was just not there as to how these effects play out, and clearly if you were designing new relocation strategies and supportive mechanisms, it matters which of these pathways are the most important ones for mediating these effects. So to try to secure insight into this area, we made use of newer technologies, and particularly the fact that sensors are chock-a-block full of, the smartphones are chock-a-block full of sensors. Many recognize the huge, hugely attractive functionality offered by smartphones, but relatively few realize just how enabling sensors are in making that possible. And the important point that we took advantage of is the sensors on these devices can be repurposed at little or no cost to their original function to provide insight into health behaviors. Similarly, we're surrounded by a growing wireless cacophony. We have Wi-Fi signals, GPS signals, cell phone signals that are bouncing all around us at each point, and that contains information. The signal strength and the availability of signals indicate important pieces of information if we're just to collect it. For example, where we are, how close we are to other people. Those are indicated by those sort of signals. And so we've built, reflecting my training as a software engineer, I supervised the construction of 2 generations of sensor platforms specifically focused on collecting data on health behavior. These sort of platforms collect information through sensors, but also through targeted surveys that can be triggered based on context that's picked up by the sensors. And data collected via these devices is backhauled to our databases when possible. So when a network connection is available, the data can be offloaded off the phone, however much gets up to it as you pass that Starbucks, or as you're located in a library, it can be uploaded, with the remaining amount staying on the phone until a later opportunity arises. Now, what's notable in this area is not merely the volume of data that's available. That's rather less important from my perspective. What's more important is the variety of cross-linked data that's available, allowing for understanding of associations between different types of sensor measurands that can be strongly indicative of underlying patterns of health behavior. So the variety, the veracity of the data, the fact that we know with accelerometry the data is much more accurate than self-report, for example. Same thing with contact patterns with people's location. The velocity of the data, the fact that we're getting data every few minutes as opposed to once a month through self-report. So we've targeted this system to try to collect data related to these factors that we often need for our models but are hard to elicit from the secondary literature or from primary data that we have collected. So we can collect data, for example, on contact networks. This is highly aggregated across the course of a week, and we can examine week to week how networks change. We can measure people's contact durations, person-to-person level contacts, from the levels of single minutes up through hours and days. We can capture information across multiple sensors and then cross-link that. Some of you in the room, particularly from engineering background, may be familiar with Metcalfe's law. Does anyone remember Metcalfe's law? Have you ever taken a networking course? Metcalfe's law posits that the value of a network rises not linearly with the number of nodes in that network, say the number of people on Facebook, but with the square of it. And it's reflective of the fact that each new person for example, can communicate with all those already on the network. And so it is with this sort of data. I would argue the value of it goes up superlinearly, perhaps arguably in a quadratic fashion with the number of different sensor types, because we can cross-link them. So we can, for example, get activity level over space across our town. We can get social interactions and where they're occurring in space. We can capture where people are congregating in spaces which are not so much geographic, but are confined spaces, such as within different floors of a building. Now, what does all this have to do with these sort of models that we're building? Well, the fact is this sort of data fills key gaps in our understanding our dynamic hypotheses. It helps us posit in a more grounded fashion aspects of microbehavior that would otherwise be subject to speculation and subject to little in the way of constraining our best guesses. So the big data that we're talking about can help ground our models, provide a rich grounding in observations, provide information for model parameterization and calibration, and conversely, the dynamic models help us make sense of this cacophony of data. Without models to help understand it, the data that's received from the sensors is nothing more than large streams of numbers. We need models of various sorts to make sense of it, and we work with statistical models to machine learning models to dynamic models. The dynamic models are particularly of particularly key benefit because they allow us to link the consequences of these data that are accumulated, for example, the contact patterns in the data, the patterns of mobility in the data, help us link those to possible choices and the consequence of those choices. So in one study we're involved in within long-term care facilities, we're looking at the spread of nosocomial infection within those facilities. And we capture information on people's movement within the facility and information related to their contact patterns within the facility. And we then turn to modeling to help us understand, okay, if people are having contacts with each other and with surfaces that could serve as reservoirs of pathogen, what is the implication in terms of how the bug spreads within the facility? What's the implication in terms of the impact of, say, patient cohorting versus improved hygienic practices on the part of the care staff in the washroom? How does that affect the burden of illness that we might anticipate given these patterns of movement? So we've brought together the sort of data on the one hand from these devices and from other aspects of big data with, on the other hand, the models in a variety of ways. We, in some cases, parameterize the data we've collected into models, for example, directly reflecting the empirical contact patterns into the simulation model. We've calibrated models to the data to try to explain the patterns we see. We've made use of a variety of inferencing mechanisms and classifying mechanisms that then work together with the simulation models. And we've trained the models to data in further studies. So we've applied these techniques in a variety of studies. Gestational diabetes work is ongoing right now with women carrying phones through their pregnancy through 6 months postpartum to capture nutritional information through the phone's camera, to capture information as reported via through self-report on blood sugar levels and insulin administration, and relate that to physical activity, mobility, social contact is measured through phone sensors. Another component that we've been emphasizing in our work is understanding and nudging these microbehaviors and the choices people make through formal choice modeling. And a lot of the goals here is to try to anticipate and incentivize behavioral responses of individuals that are less well understood through the literature and which are often contextual in nature. So in this case, we're making use of rich, cognitively informed models of agent choices within our model. Within agent-based models, by virtue of representing situated agents, they form almost an ideal platform for examining agent choice under different contexts. So, for example, agent-based models of driving behavior have long been used to reason about how to minimize traffic congestion within networks, and Moshe Ben Akiva and others have championed the use of what's known as discrete choice theory for characterizing how an individual's driving behavior changes in the context of traffic congestion, in the context of pricing changes, in the context of route length, and the context of likely time associated with different routes. And agent-based models are highly suitable for this sort of investigation. So we can represent individuals and their health choices over time. If we're investigating workforce planning, we can look at how individuals make choices at different stages of their career as to what career to pursue, whether to stay in school, whether to work in a rural region or an urban region, the type of practice with which to be affiliated, etc. Now, the problem is that in many agent-based models, the models of the rules that agents follow, the choices that they make, are guided by impoverished representation of their decision-making. In many cases, those agents behave in a probabilistic fashion and simply make decisions with certain probabilities of occurrence. In other cases, a little bit more adaptive, they make use of some simple algorithmic rules, but it has little or no bearing on actual cognitive decision-making. In other cases, yet, we may impose a rational actor model where they try to maximize their utility, but once again, it doesn't have a reflection of how empirically people tend to make decisions. Now, people in the marketing space have been applying random utility theory for years to consumer decision-making. And we partnered with a team based in Australia at CENSOC, the Center for the Study of Choice, as well as to other Australian colleagues, to look at the applications of random utility theory within the context of health models. And the two approaches complement each other to a T. So the random utility theory provides us a grounded understanding of how people make decisions, either in a more rational way or in a heuristic fashion. We can capture rough and ready heuristics that people use to make quick decisions to kind of get on with life, and where they haven't given it tremendously systematic thought. Random utility theory also provides us a quite articulated and refined set of tools for estimating preferences on the part of agents through very artfully chosen survey questions with smaller number of respondents than might naively be thought to be required. And the Center for the Study of Choice particularly specializes in tools for crafting elicitation methods using what are called stated preference methods, or stated choice methods, as opposed to revealed preference data, which can come from observation of actual behavior, such as through our smartphones. Using these sort of questions, these questionnaires, or using empirical data on people's actual decision making, we can arrive at model approximations which give us probabilities that a given agent in a certain context will choose one option as opposed to another option. So, for example, parameters within these this is a particularly simple one called a logit model, which comes with a set of heavier assumptions distributionally. There's other more flexible methods, but in this case, the betas represent parameters that are estimated through these surveys delivered to participants in a study. And an agent-based model, by incorporating a representation of agents which make use of these formalisms as created in random utility theory and as parameterized through random utility theory instruments, such as best-worst scaling type of survey questions, we can then capture within the ABM people's choices over time. But in the context of changing choice sets, as people move around within our model, we can capture the fact that they have different choice sets. If you're in one hawker court, you may not have the set of healthy options you do in another, and how people will choose within that context may be quite different than in a different spatial context. Agent-based models can allow us to capture the effects of experiences that change people's preferences or their level of knowledge about certain choices, so their confidence about their assessment of different choices in terms of their preferences. Agent-based models can capture the effects of other people surrounding that agent and capture real-world responses of an agent to choices. The fact that they make a choice and that may reserve a resource in the world, may limit the choices that are open to other individuals, etc. So we've been working in this area, particularly in the workforce planning area for Australia, together with Jeff McDonald, Terry Flynn, and Keith Masnick in Australia, but also increasingly with intramural researcher Kelvin Choi at the NIH. A final major thrust that I wanted to communicate is one that I'm arguably the most enthusiastic and most convinced about its need of all those that I've talked about, which is the potential for linking dynamic simulations with computational statistics. We do a lot of work in this area making use of Markov chain Monte Carlo methods for estimation of posteriors over parameters within the model. But what I'm actually going to be talking with you about today is the issue of closed loop modeling. The idea here is that we often, all too often within the health context, we build up a model, we calibrate it very closely to data, we put a tremendous amount of effort into crafting it to be responsive to the latest evidence base. And then, for subsequent years, we use it. We use that model for our planning. That can bring a lot of benefits to the situation, but misses out on a key opportunity. And altogether, those models' lives are shortchanged from the fact that they don't remain current. They don't remain current to the latest evidence available, and they frankly become obsolete. And often this leads them undergoing bit rot or sitting on a shelf somewhere instead of being used. So what we're doing increasingly within our work is applying a variety of techniques, from older techniques such as Kalman filtering to more modern techniques such as particle filtering as part of sequential Monte Carlo methods, which make use of what are called predictor-corrector mechanisms. And the idea here is that we have a model that's known to be fallible. All models are incomplete, all models are wrong in the same sense that all maps are incomplete and all maps are wrong. Their very incompleteness is what gives them their utility in many ways, the fact that they're manageable, but they're inevitably going to be omitting certain factors that play out in the world. And it will be a fool's errand to expect that our model, even the most carefully crafted, intricately designed model, is going to stay forever attuned with the evolution of the external situation. And the fact that it will increasingly diverge from what we know to be the case, increasingly be at odds with our evidence base looking forward, can make a difference in certain cases for our assessment of intervention trade-offs. So it can have a substantive impact on our ability to reliably evaluate the trade-off between different interventions. And so these methods, these predictor-corrector methods, seek to deal with the fallibility of all our models, but also the fact that the data that we're dealing with doesn't come from heaven. It's systematically biased. It has often small numbers issues that lead to high degree of variability, and it's not to be trusted at face value either. These predictor-corrector methods bring together, on the one hand, the model and its capturing of the regularities of the situation, together with the data, and creates a consensus estimate or consensus estimates that capture the dynamics of the situation better than either one in isolation would allow, and often in a way that complements the best features of each of those pieces of information while compensating for their weaknesses. So here we have an illustration of, for example, a model which is designed specifically. So we built this model to examine, to assess the effectiveness of these methods against known ground truth. And the model exhibits strong biases in its estimate. It has oversimplifications and enormous distortions associated with it. That means that it's quite far off from being an accurate description of how things play out in the world. But it can incorporate new data. Each time new data comes in, the model is sort of regrounded. Wakes up to the fact that, things aren't playing out like it anticipated, and it then updates its estimates as to what's going on. It can project forward from there. New data comes in, it projects, it takes that into account, projects forward, and each time new data comes in, shown at these integer points, the model is regrounded and revises its estimate as to what's likely to play out. Now, often we don't turn to models for forecasting, we turn to them for scenario evaluation, but the same process applies and can inform greatly our understanding of scenario outcomes. Moreover, a model like this can be in a position to continuously learn. Every time new data comes in, with essentially no human involvement, the model can be updated to reflect the very latest evidence that's available so that the model stays current, it stays fresh, it stays attuned to the latest understanding. So we're applying these types of approaches with two key methods. The main one we rely on is the particle filter, because it has far less onerous assumptions, it's much more flexible in the types of models to which we can apply it, and it's very easy to capture in multiple methods. And we're applying these across a variety of conditions. The final point I'll just make is the key role of relationships. This was something that my colleague Jeff McDonald helped me really appreciate in the dementia context a couple of years ago, just how central the caregiver relationship with the patient is. And all too often our models focus on the individual undergoing the health troubles directly, and the scope is defined too narrowly to capture these relationships. So if it's type 2 diabetes, we model the diabetics themselves, or those at risk of developing diabetes. If it's dementia, we capture individuals' progression through successive ages and the risk of developing different levels of dementia. And if it's an issue like postpartum depression, we focus on the mother, or maybe the mother and the baby. But increasingly, our models recognize the central role that relationships with others can play in lowering costs and improving quality of life, and improving, indeed, even length of life. So the ways in which, for example, family caregivers, particularly grandmothers, play in the context of the postpartum situation and even during pregnancy can be absolutely key to highlight certain leverage points for really making a difference. If we're interested in lowering postpartum depression among new mothers, we can get a certain distance by examining them in isolation and examining their risk factors, but we can go much further if we start considering their relationships with others and the fact that there's feedbacks involved in those relationships, and that strengthening that bond, whatever we can do to be supportive of that bond and of that ability for other family members to help engage in care, may end up rippling through to benefit the mother, benefit the baby, and potentially the grandmother as well. And similarly with dementia, if we can strengthen the relationship with caregivers, we can potentially keep the individual with incipient dementia or at risk of dementia at their home for a longer period before they go to institutional care. If we can improve the relationship between them and institutional caregivers, we can potentially prevent adverse outcomes from arising, lead to faster diagnosis of complications, and prevent them from needing to transition to acute care, defer that transition for longer, thereby saving cost, improving quality of life, and potentially improving length of life. So the role of relationships has proven quite critical to our recent modeling, and it's one in which we're investing quite a lot. So this is my final slide for the talk. Broadly speaking, addressing complex treatment and intervention strategies requires attention to a wide variety of needs that I've highlighted through the talk. There's many powerful and existing and indeed emerging tools for enhancing modeling of complex health interventions. And it's my own conviction and observation that being a pluralist with respect to these techniques can confer great value. Being able to start with a system dynamics model, explore different strategies, maybe expanding pieces of it into an agent-based model, maybe rolling it back if it proves not needed, etc., can be profoundly enabling in terms of getting more quickly to insight, and in terms of leading to a nimble incorporation of new learning. The models that we're working with are, from my own perspective, terribly fallible, and they're likely to remain so across a broad range of tasks. And it's my distinct conviction that to really deliver value with these models, we have to approach them with a close guard against hubris, and with a recognition of the fact that we need to try to keep them current with the latest of evidence as it comes in. I'll just note, just as a plug for two events that we're running this summer, which may be of interest to people, that highlight the multi-method modeling on the one hand that I've just noted, and the agent-based modeling on the other. We've run these for a number of years, the second one, and those expand on many of the topics I haven't had time to talk about today. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Oster. Questions and comments from the audience?
Thank you, Prof. I have a question about the model. So when we build a model, the aim is to simulate the disease progression, but due to the availability of the data, sometimes we have to estimate many parameters. Another rule in this is to keep a simple model rather than a simpler model. So how to decide whether we choose a simple model or whether we choose a complex model, we should combine the many parameters, but those parameters are based on estimation.
Yeah. So this is a great question. So the choice of model that one uses is problem specific, and it reflects the research question that's brought to bear. As a general rule, it is highly advised that one starts with a simple model in any case, because that's where the incremental learning can go on. As you systematically expand a model to include different factors, you gain a good intuition and insights into the impact of incorporating new factors as you go along, and that can actually change what you think you need in terms of the final model. There's a learning process that needs to go on during that modeling. So I would never recommend to someone that they try for the big bang approach of just saying, we're going to build this sophisticated model so that 2 years from now we're going to have an incredibly intricate model that we're going to be able to run finally. Instead, you want to build it up in a highly incremental fashion. And coming from much of my life in the system dynamics world, I tend to start at a more aggregate level and try exploring adding components onto it. What you mentioned, so there's a huge variety of different uses to which people turn to models. Okay, models are thinking tools, and they span the gamut from diagrams to highly articulated simulations, and the purposes that we look for, which we look to build a simple model of what I call a stylized model or a caricature model, a model that doesn't aspire to reproduce some particular situation. It's just helping us kind of reason through the implications of how certain processes might interact, say, to explain certain epi-evidence that we have. Those sort of models, you can make use of an extremely simple model structure, loosely available data, and build very quickly. By contrast, if you're seeking to do quantitative evaluation of the trade-off between different competitive interventions, where you're relying on accuracy to within 10% of that trade-off, you're going to need a model to be responsive to that that's much more detailed. That's no guarantee that you'll be able to build that model given available evidence, but to even claim that you could come close to that requires a plan to have in place mechanisms that have the requisite amount of detail. And so one of the dangers of models, I should say in general, of a simulation model is it will give you create a simulation model from whatever provenance of data, it will give you numbers out, right? And the thing is, you have to be very careful, because
the numbers will be given with great precision, but they're not indicative of great accuracy, right? You get out precise numbers, and they may have very little bearing on anything meaningful. It may be nonsense in terms of implications for your investigation. So in short, you need to start with your research question. You need to ask what factors are plausibly involved in driving this research question. I would advocate very strongly doing what system dynamics modelers do, meaning sort of labeling systematically what things are endogenous, exogenous, ignored. Start with very few things endogenous and start adding them in one by one as your intuition develops. And you'll actually likely go a different direction than you anticipate because you'll have important learning going on in that process. And that learning will be absolutely key, and it will prevent you from having a very complicated model that you get at the end where you don't know what's driving it, you don't know what's causing what behavior, you don't even know if it has bugs in it. If you build it up in that incremental fashion, you have much more reliability. And there's a whole theory of agile software engineering that is relevant to this that I could talk with you about. But it's strongly encouraged you build incrementing, you dock successive versions to make sure that they are the new versions yielding meaningful results before you go on and extend it. Okay.
Any other questions? Okay, thank you, Professor Hustle. Now it's going to be the tea break time. Please come back by 11:30. Thank you.
It felt really foreign to us to how much the legal
So at 11:30, I go next, right?
Yes.
And remind me of the time.
11:32.
Right.
45 minutes.
Yes. Including questions, right?
Yes.
So 11:30.
2, 1.
But that's for two talks,
talks.
right? So it's an hour and a half. So 45 minutes, okay.
I will raise some color paper to you, and
Good, perfect.
yellow paper means 10 minutes left,
Okay.
and orange paper means 5 minutes left.
Okay,
so
and you'll raise those for 30 minutes or for the 45?
for the 45 minutes.
Okay,
Yeah,
I
45
won't
minutes.
I won't use the whole time.
Oh, okay, sure.
Because
Then.
the way you asked me to plan it was 30 minutes speaking, 15 minutes.
I would like to
Okay, sure.
That's what I plan to do.
That's no problem. That's no problem.
All right.
That's good.
I just wanted to check to make sure that my
But what I will do is
the right
I will.
All we are worried is
I
that
will-
you go too far.
Go too far.
Yes.
But
Yeah,
that is fine.
I got that. Okay.
But probably Peter won't be here. Yeah. I'm sorry. Tomorrow, right? Of course, tomorrow would actually be better in that.
Just check.
But I don't
I want
want
to check to make sure you have the latest version of mine. Where do you have it stored? This is Jonathan's.
Yeah.
Yeah. It turns out that it turns out that my
I
colleague
sent you a
at home is also
PPSX.
going to work on the paper, but I'm going to have to do some
It
bonus
worked?
Yes.
edits.
Worked
with
fine?
it.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. It's due, I think, East Coast time tonight, and so I have another 18 hours or something. But if other people can't do it, let's do it tonight, and I'll make it happen. Okay. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. That's fine.
Amazing.
All right. And for tomorrow, where are we?
Yeah.
We are at room 9.
In the same
Yeah,
building?
the
So-
same building at from 9 a.m.
And room 9A?
Yeah.
Meaning 9th floor?
9th floor.
Okay. From 9 a.m.
Oh, okay. Sure.
And we'll organize it how? It'll be...
open to discussing that.
So
I'm
the room has a
giving one in
projector,
Australia
so
next year.
Okay.
I'll
plug in my computer?
Yeah,
because
you
I'll
can
be able to
just
have to run the
demonstrate.
model and
Yeah.
build
Mine
it
is
and
back
so
at
on.
Backcom in
Okay.
Saskatoon in
That way,
June,
myself
and there's one in
Stefan will be
August
there.
in the same. That's where all my
Where is
TAs
Stefan?
are.
I think he stepped outside.
Okay,
to
that's
break.
fine.
No, this
So
is
you're
Canada.
both going to be.
Yeah,
Canada,
and
And then
But
the schedule is 9
To
to
5
5
p.m.
p.m.
and we'll have a tea break.
It's not too far,
in the
but
morning and lunch.
but yeah, those are going
something,
on.
and
But
then
another
lunch
tea
I would be
break.
open.
in the
I'm doing
afternoon.
another
lunch
one in
will be
North
at 12:30
Carolina.
for an
Okay.
hour.
Okay.
Yeah.
Also the ones. Okay.
Sure.
And
Sure.
will people be able to plug
Yeah.
in their computers?
Yes, so we checked and we have plenty of.
There's plenty of
Yeah.
electricity and all that. Do you know if people are bringing their computers?
I noted.
No, I've gotten
they need
invited
to bring their
to
computer.
Shanghai.
And they have downloaded the
Yeah,
software.
I
But
was
not
reminded
acted on it, and
twice.
also
Okay.
So they
Saturday,
should.
but
Okay, good.
yeah.
In the room here, do you
But
know
no, I'd be very open
sort
to
of
discussing that. That sounds
who's
quite
present?
interesting.
Like
We
what
need to
kind
talk
of
with-
level would be?
Yeah. Right. Absolutely. Yeah.
I would
We
say
do want
maybe
okay.
introductory.
Let's talk further.
That's
You're here
not yet.
tomorrow.
Yeah.
Okay.
Oh,
Because that's
okay,
that's
cool.
the level at which I aimed it.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay,
Yeah.
good. Thank you.
No problem.
Yeah. Oh, is that right? Okay. You know the key person behind that model.
Another
is
lady
Susan
who
here.
wants to sign up for the
She's-
agent-based modeling
Yeah.
seminar.
So I'll introduce you to her. But she was the one that physically built the 3D model involving TB contact trace, simulated contact tracing, and prioritizing it with different histories. Yeah. Well, thanks too much. Thanks. Sure. Sure.
Well, 2 or 3 years.
would you like to look at? So it's actually
Yeah.
vertical arrows, and
So
then it's somewhat
that-
sensitive. So would you like to give it a try? So
Oh,
it's
that
a
one.
down arrow. Down arrow goes the next.
Ah,
step.
okay,
Yeah.
right, okay, yeah.
And then in the middle is a laser pointer.
Cool.
Yeah.
Right, so down. Okay. Great. That's back, that's done.
Yeah.
Okay.
Better not fall asleep in this one, had I?
Oh no, you better not. It'd be very insulting, Peter. I didn't fall asleep for yours. I was highly attentive to the whole thing.
If I do, nothing personal.
I will take it personally. Great, so it's 4. That's what I need to know. Great.
And I'll bring the water for your turn. So I just.
Okay, I've
yeah.
got some water anyway. It's okay.
Oh, okay.
Okay, thank you very much. Oh, can't I do the close thing? I'll give you taxi break. True.
and the click goes. It's the vertical, so the down, it goes down.
This is forward?
That, yes.
This is backward?
Yeah.
Okay.
In the middle is a laser.
Okay.
So you'll be using this microphone.
We'll see if I don't usually need it, but if
Yes.
if
The switch is on the bottom. So do you want me to keep it on or keep it off?
we'll see.
Okay.
Oh, I should probably get my computer, eh?
Help you.
Thank you so much. That's really very kind of you. Thank you. Thanks so much, Amina.
No problem.
Great. Wonderful. Oops, oops. Oh, yeah, gosh.
Fortunately, there are some ways to treat it. You can do surgery to try and remove the atrial fibrillation itself, to act on the atrium and in some way try to make it not fibrillate anymore. It's not that easy to do, and it's not that consistently successful. So the preferred approach has typically been to give some sort of anticoagulant, oral medication, and the most common one now well known to produce a very substantial reduction of about 2/3 of the risk is warfarin. So warfarin is a medication that makes your blood clot less intensely, and therefore tries to prevent the formation of those clots and emboli. Unfortunately, warfarin is rat poison, and the reason it poisons rats is that given in a slightly higher dose, it causes what you would expect, nasty bleeding. So you get gastrointestinal hemorrhage, and you get, perversely, bleeding into the brain. So you're trying to prevent a stroke, but you get another kind of stroke by bleeding into that brain. It's a very difficult medication to use properly. The dose is very sensitive to what other medications you're on, to what you eat, and so on. So about half of the time, most patients on warfarin outside of clinical trials are not in the appropriate range. They're either too low and therefore at risk of a stroke, or too high and therefore at risk of bleeding. And in fact, less than half the patients who should be using it are using it because of the difficulties in taking it, the additional monitoring.